Verified incident logs. Authentic footage. Pure accountability. Welcome to Bodycam Incident Reports.
Step away from the keypad. What are you installing into the reader?
I'm not installing anything.
Drop the tool and give me your ID right now.
My state credentials are in my jacket. I
said stop reaching. Turn around and put your hands behind your back.
At 2:14 p.m., the overcast sky cast a flat gray light across the concrete sidewalk of 14th Street. Mark Phillips stood on the pavement, facing a commercial ATM embedded into the red brick facade of a closed bank branch. He wore a heavy navy blue canvas work jacket, dark gray slacks, and brown leather boots. In his left hand, he held a ruggedized tablet encased in a thick black rubber drop shell. In his right hand, he held an 8-inch NACO stainless steel digital caliper. Mark stepped closer to the machine. He positioned the heavy steel jaws of the caliper against the edge of the ATM's numerical keypad. He rolled the metal thumb wheel. The jaws slid apart. The digital LCD screen mounted on the sliding carriage flashed a sequence of black numbers. Mark looked at the screen, shifted his tablet, and typed the measurement into an open spreadsheet. He moved his attention to the card reader. The reader featured a protruding, translucent green plastic bezel. Before we see how a routine compliance check destroys a patrolman's career, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching from today. Mark adjusted his grip on the steel caliper. He turned the tool vertically. Protruding from the bottom of the steel track was a thin, needle-like depth-measuring rod. Mark carefully guided the tip of the steel rod directly into the narrow seam between the green plastic bezel and the machine's internal metal chassis. He pushed the slider down, driving the metal probe deeper into the card slot. He held the steel device perfectly still against the plastic reader, watching the numbers shift on the LCD screen. A black Ford Police Interceptor utility turned the corner onto 14th Street. The cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb, stopping 15 feet away from the ATM. The emergency lights were off. Officer Paul Martin shifted the vehicle into park. He looked through the passenger side window. He saw a man in a dark jacket standing flush against the ATM. He saw the thick black tablet. He saw the heavy steel tool. He saw the thin metal rod inserted directly into the green plastic card slot. Martin opened his door. He stepped out onto the concrete. He kept his right hand resting just above the retention hood of his holstered 9mm weapon. His heavy boots hit the pavement, closing the distance. "Step away from the keypad," Martin ordered. His voice was loud, projecting across the empty sidewalk. Mark stopped turning the thumb wheel. He did not pull the depth rod out of the card slot. He slowly turned his head, looking over his right shoulder. "What are you installing into the reader?" Martin asked. He stopped 6 feet away, keeping his body bladed slightly to the right. Mark pulled the steel caliper out of the machine. He lowered his arms, holding the tools at his waist. He held Martin's gaze for 2 seconds. "I'm not installing anything," Mark said. "Title III compliance. I'm verifying the bezel tolerance." Martin looked at the metal tool. He looked at the digital screen. He looked at Mark's face. "Drop the tool and give me your ID," Martin commanded. "Right now." Mark did not drop the caliper. He shifted the heavy steel tool into his left hand, pressing it against the back of his tablet. His right hand was now empty. "My state credentials are in my inner left breast pocket," Mark stated. Mark slowly raised his right arm. He moved his open hand toward the brass zipper of his navy canvas jacket. "I said stop reaching," Martin shouted. Martin lunged forward. He closed the 6-foot gap in a single step. He thrust his left hand out, grabbing the thick canvas collar of Mark's jacket. He locked his grip, twisted his hips, and drove his right shoulder directly into Mark's upper back. Mark's chest slammed into the fiberglass chassis of the ATM. The heavy plastic casing cracked under the impact. Mark's hands opened. The ruggedized tablet slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete sidewalk with a dull thud. The stainless steel digital caliper hit the pavement a second later. the metal clattering sharply as it bounced off the curb. "Hands behind your back!" Martin yelled, pressing his forearm tightly against the base of Mark's neck, pinning his right cheek against the ATM's display screen. Mark's boots slipped 3 inches across the concrete. As his chest compressed against the machine, he brought both of his arms down and crossed his wrists behind the small of his back. Martin reached to his duty belt. He pulled his steel handcuffs from their pouch. He clamped the first bracelet over Mark's right wrist, pressing the ratchets down. Click, click. He grabbed the left wrist, pulled it tight, and secured the second bracelet. Martin stepped back, keeping his grip on the steel chain connecting the cuffs. Mark remained pinned against the machine. He looked down at the concrete sidewalk. The digital LCD screen of the caliper lay face up on the pavement. The screen was cracked, the black numbers bleeding into a solid dark line across the display. "Walk to the vehicle," Martin ordered. He pulled the chain. Mark stood up straight, stepped over his broken equipment, and walked toward the patrol cruiser. The interior of the patrol cruiser was separated by a solid sheet of thick plexiglass. Mark sat on the molded hard plastic rear bench. He kept his knees together, his boots planted flat on the rubber floor mat. His cuffed hands were pressed tightly against his lower back. Officer Martin drove in silence. He turned off the main avenue and pulled into the narrow concrete alleyway behind the precinct. He stopped the cruiser in front of a corrugated metal door. A sensor registered the vehicle. The metal door rolled upward, heavy chains grinding against the gears. Martin drove forward into the concrete sally port. The metal door rolled back down behind them, sealing the garage. Martin shifted the car into park and turned off the engine. He stepped out of the vehicle. He walked to a row of heavy-gauge steel lockboxes bolted to the concrete wall. He unholstered his 9mm service weapon, placed it flat inside the box, closed the steel door, and turned the key. He pulled the key from the cylinder, clipped it to his belt, and walked back to the cruiser. He opened the rear door. "Step out," Martin ordered. Mark slid his legs across the plastic bench, placed his boots on the concrete, and stood up. Martin gripped Mark by the left bicep and guided him through the heavy steel security door into the booking room. The room was illuminated by rows of harsh, white fluorescent tubes. Sergeant Brown sat behind a raised stainless steel booking counter, typing on a mechanical keyboard. He stopped typing and looked up. Martin guided Mark to the center of the room. "Face the wall," Martin instructed. Mark turned his back to the booking desk. He stepped toward the blank cinder block wall. Martin stepped up to the stainless steel counter. He reached into his left cargo pocket and pulled out the NACO digital caliper and the cracked tablet he had retrieved from the sidewalk. He placed them onto the metal desk. The steel tool landed with a heavy clink. "Skimming equipment installation," Martin reported. "Suspect refused to identify." Martin walked back to Mark. He slid his hand into the inner left breast pocket of the navy canvas jacket. He pulled out a black leather bifold wallet. He walked back and dropped the wallet onto the counter next to the caliper. Sergeant Brown stood up. He looked down at the items. He reached out and picked up the 8-inch steel caliper. He weighed it in his palm. He looked at the 2 solid metal jaws. He ran his bare thumb over the laser-etched millimeter increments running down the length of the track. He turned the tool over, his index finger tracing the cold, machined edge of the depth rod. Brown set the heavy steel back onto the stainless counter. He reached for the black leather wallet. He flipped it open. The harsh fluorescent overhead lights reflected off a solid piece of recessed metal. It was a gold shield. Engraved across the top of the star, in heavy black enamel, were the words, "Department of Financial Institutions." Printed below was a single title, Field Inspector. Tucked tightly behind the clear plastic ID window was a folded piece of white paper. Brown pulled it out. He unfolded the paper and flattened it against the desk. The header read, Official Title 3, ADA, Compliance Audit, Daily Route Sheet. Brown's eyes tracked down the printed list of addresses. Halfway down the page, highlighted in yellow marker, was the address for the 14th Street ATM. Brown let go of the paper. He pulled his hands back from the edge of the desk. He placed both palms flat against his own thighs. He looked at the printed route sheet. He closed the black leather wallet. He looked at Officer Martin. Martin stood 3 feet behind Mark. He looked down at the gold shield reflecting the overhead lights. He looked at the broken tool. Martin swallowed. He shifted his weight off his left foot. The rubber sole of his boot squeaked against the linoleum. Brown reached to his duty belt. He unhooked a brass keyring. He isolated a flat silver key between his thumb and index finger. He walked around the edge of the stainless steel counter and stepped into the center of the room. Brown stopped directly behind Mark. He inserted the silver key into the right handcuff. He turned the key. The metal arch released with a sharp snap. Brown repeated the motion on the left handcuff. Another snap. Mark brought his arms forward. Deep red indentations circled the skin of both wrists. He let his arms hang straight down. His fingers relaxed. He did not rub his wrists. He did not touch his shoulders. Mark turned his body to face the room. He walked back to the stainless steel counter. He picked up his folded route sheet, slipped it back into his wallet, and placed the wallet into his jacket pocket. He held Sergeant Brown's gaze, waiting until the room was completely silent. "Sergeant," Mark said, "I need this officer's body-worn camera secured in an evidence bag. Do it immediately." Sergeant Brown walked around the edge of the stainless steel counter. He stopped directly in front of Officer Martin. Martin kept his arms at his sides. Brown reached out. He gripped the black plastic housing of the Axon body camera mounted to the center of Martin's uniform shirt. He pressed the dual release tabs. The magnetic clip disengaged with a sharp snap. Brown pulled the device free. He walked back to the desk. He pulled a clear polyurethane evidence bag from a lower drawer. He dropped the camera inside. He peeled the white backing off the red adhesive seal, folded the top over, and pressed the plastic flat. He picked up a black marker. The felt tip squeaked against the plastic as he signed his initials across the tamper-evident line. Mark pointed to the NACO caliper and the shattered tablet resting on the metal counter. "Property voucher," Mark said. "Seal the damaged equipment." Brown pulled 2 more plastic bags from the drawer. He slid the heavy steel tool into the first. He slid the cracked tablet into the second. The broken glass scraped against the polyurethane. He sealed both adhesive strips. He opened a bound ledger, filled out 3 lines of text, and ripped a yellow carbon copy receipt from the perforated spine. He handed the paper across the counter. Mark took the yellow receipt. He turned away from the desk. He walked down the main corridor of the precinct, his boots hitting the polished linoleum in a steady, even rhythm. He reached the double exit doors. He pressed his palms against the heavy metal crash bar. The hydraulic hinges hissed. Mark stepped out into the gray afternoon air. He folded the yellow paper exactly in half, then into quarters, and slid it deep into the pocket of his canvas jacket. The yellow receipt lay unfolded on a 12-foot polished mahogany conference table. The sharp creases from the folds formed a grid across the paper. Next to the receipt sat the 2 sealed evidence bags. The cracked screen of the tablet and the steel jaws of the caliper pressed tightly against the clear plastic. Mark sat in a high-backed leather chair. Across the table sat a man wearing a dark gray tailored suit. The man opened a manila folder. He pulled out a stack of legal paper. He slid the stack across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Mark. The header on the first page was printed in bold black ink, "Notice of Claim." Below the header was a single line identifying the plaintiff, Mark Phillips. Below that, the defendant, Officer Paul Martin. Mark picked up a metal fountain pen from the table. He unscrewed the cap and pushed it onto the back of the barrel. He turned to the last page of the document. He pressed the metal nib against the paper. The pen scratched rapidly against the surface as he signed his name on the solid black line. He slid the document back across the table. The man in the suit picked up a heavy, spring-loaded rubber stamp. He pressed the mechanism down onto an ink pad. He positioned the plastic base over the front page of the document and pushed the handle down. The internal cylinder rotated. The red ink stamped onto the paper. Received. A single sheet of paper landed face up on the bare metal table in room 402 of the precinct. Room 402 had pale green cinder block walls and no windows. A single fluorescent light hummed violently in the ceiling. Officer Martin sat in a gray folding chair. He was still wearing his dark blue uniform. Two men wearing plainclothes suits stood inside the frame of the closed door. They stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the exit. Their hands hung empty at their sides. They looked directly at Martin. They did not speak. Martin looked at the paper resting on the gray surface. The text was printed in standard Arial font. Order of administrative leave. Martin reached down to his waist. He grabbed the heavy brass buckle of his duty belt. He pulled the thick leather strap through the metal loop. The Velcro backing tore with a loud, scratching rip that echoed off the cinder block walls. Martin let the belt drop from his waist. He caught it with his left hand. He lifted the entire rig, the holstered 9mm weapon, the steel handcuffs, the spare magazines, the black radio, and placed it onto the gray metal table. The heavy equipment hit the surface with a loud, metallic crash. Martin raised his right hand to his chest. He unclasped the safety pin on the back of his silver police shield. He pulled the metal badge free from the dark blue fabric. He pressed the silver shield flat against the center of the printed page. He pulled his fingers away, leaving the cool metal resting perfectly aligned over the black text. Room 4. B of the municipal courthouse was heavily air-conditioned. The black plastic keys of the stenotype machine depressed in rapid clusters as the court reporter logged the session. Former Officer Paul Martin sat on the right side of a long oak conference table. He wore a light gray suit. Sitting directly to his left was William Hayes, an attorney provided by the Police Benevolent Association. Hayes had a thick printed file open in front of him. On the opposite side of the table sat Mark Phillips. Next to Mark sat Arthur Vance, a civil rights litigator. At the head of the table, a digital projector illuminated a pull-down screen. Vance reached under the table. He lifted a heavy blue 3-ring binder and dropped it flat onto the oak surface. The gold lettering on the cover read, City Police Department, Patrol Guide. Vance pushed the binder across the table. It stopped inches from Martin's hands. Mr. Martin, Vance said, open the binder to section 212, page 4. Hayes raised his hand from the table. Objection. My client is no longer employed by the department. The patrol guide is not relevant to his current status. He was employed on the date of the incident, Vance stated, looking directly at the court reporter. Note the objection for the record. Mr. Martin, open the binder. Martin looked at Hayes. Hayes gave a short, single nod. Martin opened the heavy blue cover. He turned the thick, glossy pages until he reached the specified section. Read the heading of section 212 aloud, Vance instructed. Investigative encounters and use of force, Martin read. Now read subsection B, paragraph 2, Vance said. Martin traced his index finger down the page. An officer must establish reasonable suspicion of a specific crime before initiating physical contact. Visual confirmation of a weapon or illegal implement is required prior to escalation. Vance reached to the floor again. He lifted a clear polyurethane evidence bag and placed it on the table. Inside the sealed plastic was the heavy stainless steel NACO caliper, its LCD screen shattered. The yellow evidence tag attached to the bag bore Sergeant Brown's signature. Vance slid the sealed bag across the table until it rested directly on top of the open patrol guide. Vance picked up a glossy 8x10 photograph and laid it next to the bag. The photograph showed a standard electronic card skimmer. It was made of green plastic, embedded with microchips and copper wiring. Mr. Martin, Vance said, look at the photograph of the skimmer. Now look at the solid stainless steel measuring tool inside the evidence bag. Do they look alike? Objection. calls for speculation, Hayes interrupted. It calls for visual identification, Vance countered. Answer the question, Mr. Martin. Martin looked at the green plastic in the photo. He looked at the laser-etched steel in the bag. No, Martin said. Did you visually confirm copper wiring, a magnetic redhead, or a data transmitter before you grabbed my client by the throat? Vance asked. I saw a metallic object inserted into the reader, Martin said. Yes or no, Mr. Martin? Did you confirm it was a skimming device? Martin shifted his weight in the leather chair. No. Vance picked up a black plastic remote. He aimed it at the projector. The video from Martin's body-worn camera played on the screen. The audio echoed through the room. Drop the tool and give me your ID, Martin's recorded voice ordered. Right now. Vance pressed the button. The video froze. Vance picked up a stapled transcript and slid it across the oak table toward Martin. Read line 14. Martin looked at the paper. Drop the tool and give me your ID. Vance pressed the remote. The video resumed. Mark Phillips's recorded voice played through the speakers. My state credentials are in my inner left breast pocket. The video showed Mark's right hand moving slowly toward the zipper of his jacket. I said stop reaching, Martin's recorded voice shouted. The camera frame jerked forward. The loud crack of plastic hitting the ATM echoed through the room. Vance paused the video. The screen froze on a motion-blurred frame of the concrete sidewalk. Vance pointed his pen at the transcript. Red line 18, Vance said. Martin looked at the paper. I said stop reaching. Vance set the remote down. He rested his hands flat on the oak table. You commanded my client to provide his identification, Vance said. 2 seconds later, you commanded him not to move his hands. Hayes leaned forward. Arthur, you are badgering the witness. Vance ignored the union lawyer. He kept his eyes locked on Martin. Is it physically possible, Vance asked, his voice steady, to retrieve a wallet from an inner jacket pocket without reaching for it? Martin reached for the glass of ice water sitting on the table, his fingers wrapped around the wet glass. The ice clinked sharply against the rim. He lifted the glass to his mouth and took a slow drink. He set the glass back down. Martin looked at the paused, blurred image on the projector screen. He looked at the heavy steel caliper resting inside the plastic bag. He looked at Mark Phillips sitting silently on the other side of the table. No, Martin said. The stenotype machine clacked twice. Vance picked up his pen. No further questions. Room 412 of the Municipal Administration Building was perfectly silent. The air conditioning vents pushed cold air over the long mahogany conference table. Mark Phillips sat on the left side of the table next to his attorney, Arthur Vance. He wore his heavy navy blue canvas work jacket. Sitting directly across the table was the lead counsel for the city. He wore a dark blue tailored suit. A thick stack of printed legal documents sat between them. The top page was titled, Voluntary Settlement Agreement and Release of All Claims. Mark's signature, written in black ink, rested on the bottom line of the final page. The city council reached to his right. He pulled a wide, leather-bound checkbook toward the center of the table. He flipped the heavy cover open. The paper checks inside featured the official gold seal of the city treasurer, printed in the upper left corner. The counsel picked up a silver ballpoint pen. He pressed the tip against the date line and wrote the current date. He moved down to the pay to the order of line and printed the name Mark Phillips. He moved the pen to the numerical box. He wrote a 1. He wrote a comma. He wrote a 5 followed by 5 zeros. He added a decimal point and 2 more zeros. He moved to the signature line at the bottom right. He signed his name rapidly, the ballpoint carving deep indentations into the paper. He placed the pen down. He gripped the left edge of the check with his thumb and index finger. He pulled the paper up and to the right. The check tore away from the binding along the perforated edge with a rapid staccato ripping sound. The counsel slid the check across the polished mahogany. The paper stopped directly in front of Mark. Mark picked up the check. He looked at the printed numbers. $1,500,000. He folded the rectangular paper exactly in half, matching the outer edges. He slid the folded check deep into the inner left breast pocket of his canvas jacket. He stood up from the leather chair. He pushed the chair back. He turned and walked out of the room. The locker room in the basement of the police precinct smelled of floor wax and stale air. Rows of tall gray steel lockers lined the concrete floor. Paul Martin stood in front of locker number 42. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, blue jeans, and white sneakers. A brown corrugated cardboard box rested on the concrete floor next to his left foot. Martin reached up to the master lock secured to the locker handle. He pinched the black combination dial between his thumb and index finger. He spun the dial 3 full rotations to the right, stopping on the number 34. He turned it to the left, passing 34 once, and stopped on 12. He turned it back to the right, stopping precisely on the number 28. He pulled down on the body of the lock. The hardened steel shackle popped open with a sharp click. Martin pulled the lock off the latch mechanism. He set the lock on top of the adjacent locker. He grabbed the vertical metal handle and pulled. The heavy steel door swung outward, the metal hinges squeaking loudly in the empty room. Inside the locker, a dark blue uniform shirt hung on a thin wire hanger. The fabric was pressed. The sleeves were empty. Martin reached in and grabbed the wire hanger. He lifted it off the metal crossbar. The metal scraped against metal. He laid the shirt flat against the locker door. He unbuttoned the front. He slipped the wire hanger out from the collar and dropped the wire onto the bottom shelf. He folded the left sleeve of the uniform shirt inward. He folded the right sleeve inward. He folded the shirt in half from the bottom hem to the collar. He bent down, picked up the folded dark blue fabric, and placed it flat into the bottom of the cardboard box. He stood up. He looked inside the locker. The metal hooks were bare. The shelf was empty. Martin grabbed the edge of the steel door. He pushed it closed. The door hit the frame with a loud, hollow, metallic slam. He lowered the latch over the hasp. He picked up the master lock. He threaded the steel shackle through the hasp hole. He squeezed the lock body upward against the shackle. The internal bearings locked into place. The padlock snapped shut. Martin leaned down and picked up the cardboard box. He turned and walked down the row of gray lockers toward the exit door. Some mistakes cost a badge. Profiling the wrong man costs millions. Drop a like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what was the exact second the officer realized he was holding a piece of steel instead of a skimmer? I'll see you in the next one.
The incident review concludes here. To support continued transparency, kindly like and subscribe. We appreciate you watching Bodycam Incident Reports.